Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. At the end of Mark chapter 7, we have an example of Jesus healing a man who was deaf and had an inability to speak clearly, had an impediment of speech. Now, I think it's easy for us to read stories such as this as just kind of examples of Jesus acting out of love and compassion for those who are suffering from some physical problem, whatever that might be. And I don't want to discount that. Certainly, Jesus is acting out of love and compassion when he heals. But there's more going on than simply him in using his divine power to heal a person. These particular incidences, especially this one, are windows into a bigger theme that we see rooted in the Old Testament and coming to full flower in the life and ministry of Jesus. What I want to show you in this video is that there are a number of allusions, hints in Mark chapter 7, which point back to Isaiah chapter 35. Isaiah chapter 35 is Isaiah's depiction of the new creation as well as new Exodus, but especially the new creation that's going to come with the arrival of the Son of David, with the arrival of the Messiah. So when you put Mark chapter 7 alongside Isaiah chapter 35, what we're going to see is that when Jesus heals this one man, he is opening up a window for us to see that his ministry is that of new creation, that he is fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah, so that what he does for this one man in giving him the ability to hear and the ability to speak clearly, that this is, as it were, a sign of the coming new creation, which Jesus implements, inaugurates already in his ministry. Now, a word about the extent of this reading. Depending on which church you go to and which series of readings you use, you might be looking at a larger portion of Mark chapter 7 or a smaller portion of Mark chapter 7. What we're going to concentrate on is Mark 7:31 and following. But some readings are going to include the story of the Syrophoenician woman, the mother who comes to Jesus and at first is seemingly rebuffed by him. If you want to look at a video that I've done of that particular story, you can check out this one. It's called A Cruel Christ, the Canaanite woman's dogged faith when Jesus says no. You can find that on the 1517 YouTube channel, so you can look at that if you're interested in that particular part of Mark chapter 7. We're going to pick up with Mark chapter 7, verse 31 and following. And first we want to orient ourselves as to exactly where all of these things are happening. So verse 31 says that Jesus returned from the region of Tyre. That's where he had healed the daughter of the woman who came to him. And he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. So if you see the map here, you kind of get a general idea of the travel pattern of Jesus. He went from around the Sea of Galilee up to the coastal city of Tyre, then up to the city of Sidon, and then somehow, we're not given exactly his directions, but he came all the way back to the Decapolis, which is, of course, on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So our English word Decapolis is taken directly from the Greek, which you can see here on the screen, Decapolis, and that just literally means 10 towns, 10 cities. The Decapolis is first mentioned in the New Testament, but it's also mentioned later in the first century by the Jewish historian Josephus. It's also mentioned by Pliny the Elder. The Decapolis, as you can see on the map here, is this region to the south and to the east of the Sea of Galilee. This is the important point. It is primarily a non-Jewish, so primarily a Gentile region. So Jesus goes from the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is non-Jewish, which is Gentile, all the way now to another Gentile region, to the Decapolis. So you can see that his ministry is not just to Jews, but to non-Jews, to Gentiles as well. Now, before we get into the details here of the rest of the story, it is interesting to see how in Mark you have a number of parallels between the healing that we're just about to look at and the way that Jesus heals this man and some other parallel stories in the Gospel of Mark. For instance, Mark 5 records the healing of that legion man. Remember him, the one who was possessed by this legion of demons? And he goes on to proclaim Jesus in the Decapolis. So you can read about that in Mark chapter 5. That's paralleled, of course, by Jesus being here in the region of the Decapolis again. Secondly, if you jump forward to Mark 8, Jesus is going to use saliva to heal a blind man, just as we shall see, Here in Mark 7, he uses saliva to heal a mute man with this speech impediment. And then thirdly, all the way back in Mark 5, Jesus uses the Aramaic phrase talitha kumi to raise a little girl from the dead. Just as, in this case, in Mark 7, he's going to use the Aramaic word ephphatha to open the ears of this deaf man. So that kind of sets the context of where this story fits into the pattern of Mark's gospel and also exactly where Jesus is geographically located. I point this out often in my videos, but it's worth saying again. Always pay attention to where things happen, because very often in the Bible, geography is theological and theology is geographical. So where things happen, such as the Decapolis, are significant. Jesus is not in a Jewish region. He's in a Gentile region, indicative of the fact that the Messiah comes not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles. So bear that in mind as we move forward. Okay, what do the verses say that follow this? Verse 32, they brought to him, they being, I guess, these people that are around Jesus, they're not really specified as to who they are, but they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. The Greek for speech impediment is mogilalos, and it can be translated speaking with difficulty. Now, here is the important thing about this particular word. So we've talked in our other videos about this literary technique called metalepsis. It's part of intertextuality. Intertextuality just meaning how various texts are related one to another. Of course, in the scriptures, this often works with the New Testament, quoting or alluding to or echoing Old Testament text. Now, in this particular case, what we have is this metalepsis. Metalepsis is where a word or a phrase will be quoted from an earlier text with the expectation that we will go to that earlier text and we'll compare it with the text which quotes it and let these two, as it were, engage in dialogue. So we put them side by side and we see how they help to interpret each other. Now, what's important here is that this Greek word for speaking with difficulty only occurs one time in the New Testament, in Mark chapter 7. It doesn't occur anywhere else. And it only occurs one time in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So once in the Old Testament in the Septuagint, once in the New Testament in Mark. So let's put these two together and see what we find. So if you go all the way back to Isaiah 35, verse 6, and this translation is from the Septuagint, we read, "Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the stammerer's tongue, that is the tongue of the one who speaks with difficulty, will be clear." So there's our Greek word, mogilalos. "Because," Isaiah goes on, "water has broken forth in the desert and a ravine in a thirsting land." Now here's what I encourage you to do. Go back to Isaiah 35. Actually, go back to Isaiah 34 and 35 and read the entire chapter. I'm going to point out in just a second that not just once in this verse, but twice, language is going to be used in Mark, which sends us back to Isaiah chapter 35. So let me kind of set the context for you. So Isaiah 34 is Isaiah's description of how there's sort of an undoing of creation. As creation is just kind of coming apart. It's devolving back into chaos, kind of a Genesis 1 verse 2 situation. In fact, in Isaiah 34, he actually uses the word tohu and tohu vavohu, this formlessness and void that is used in Genesis 1 verse 2 to describe kind of this pre-organization of creation when everything was chaotic and God had not yet spoken his word to bring order out of this chaos. So tohu vavohu occur in Isaiah 34. So Isaiah 34 is kind of the bad news for creation story. Isaiah 35, on the other hand, presents the good news of the recreation that is going to be affected by the arrival of the Son of David, who is going to turn deserts into streams of water. The wilderness is going to break out in flowers. And then it goes on to talk about how there's going to be healing, that those who are lame can walk. And as we just saw, those who are having trouble speaking are going to be able to speak, and the blind will see. And then the chapter ends, Isaiah 35 ends with the description of the people of God having a highway of holiness by which they can travel all the way back to Zion. So, what's happening? When Mark uses that particular word to describe this man with a speech impediment, he's sending us back to Isaiah 35, and he's saying, hey, what I want you to do is pay careful attention to how Isaiah 35 is reflective of the doings of Jesus in Mark chapter 7. We're going to talk more about this in just a second, but let's continue with the next couple of verses and see what happens next. Taking him aside, that is Jesus taking this man aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he stenadzo, he sighed, and said to him, Ephphatha, which is the Aramaic word meaning be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Now, this is the second of these examples of where Mark chapter 7, in this particular example of healing, uses words that send us back to Isaiah chapter 35. So Mark is making sure, by the language that he chooses to describe this, that we read this messianic healing in light of the new creation that the Messiah is going to effect according to Isaiah chapter 35. Now let's look at how this verb for sighing is reflected in the prophet Isaiah. So the verb is stenadzo. The noun is stenagmos, and that is the word used in Isaiah 35, verse 10. There will be praise and rejoicing, and happiness will overtake them. Pangs and sorrow and groaning or sighing have fled away. This is Isaiah 35's description of how in this recreative act of the Messiah, all of this bad stuff is going to pass away. And then the same language is reflected in Isaiah 51, which is another section about the work of the Messiah, especially his work of effecting a new exodus. For they will be brought back by the Lord, that brought back from exile. They will come to Zion with joy and eternal rejoicing, for praise will be upon their head, and joy will seize them. Grief and sorrow and stenagmos, sighing, will have fled. Now, Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 51 are the background now for what John writes about in Revelation 21, verse 14, where he's describing how the Lord, in his second coming, when he effects a new creation at the end of time, will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. So what's going on here? What's going on is that when Mark tells the story of the healing by Jesus of this man who's deaf and has this speech impediment, he's using language to direct us back to this entire chapter. Why? Because he wants us to see that when Jesus heals this one man of his bodily ailments, this healing is a window into the new creation that the Messiah brings about by his life, death, and resurrection. When Jesus is resurrected, he inaugurates this new creation that is spreading by means of the work of his kingdom. And we, who are joined to Christ, we already have the first fruits, the down payment, as it were, of the promise of this full bodily healing that we are going to experience in our resurrection. You see, chapters like Isaiah 35, where they picture the new creation that comes in the Messiah, those promises are fulfilled in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who then is the resurrection of the life. Now, when we are joined to Christ, we enter into this new creation. Like Paul says, 2 Corinthians 5, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. We've been Isaiah 35'd, if you will, by our union with Christ. So what Jesus is doing in his ministry, in healing people who are blind or lame or like this man deaf and have a speech impediment, he is giving us these promises, down payments, if you will, of what is going to be brought in the full in his resurrection. These are windows into the future, or if you prefer, the future resurrection and new creation is already breaking into the present in the ministry of Jesus, and of course, in our lives as well as we are joined to Christ. Now, you might be saying to yourself, okay, I'm still wondering why Jesus spit and used his fingers and all of that. Well, I think the best way to explain that is this is the Creator. Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh, who has come to this son of Adam, if you will, this person who's suffering from Adam's failures by a body that is far from perfect. The Creator has come in the flesh to now stand before this one who is sick, who's all wrapped up in the struggles of this old fallen creation. And he's doing for this man the same thing that he did way back in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where God, as it were, got his hands dirty when he made Adam. He made him from the dust. And then he made Eve, of course, from the side of Adam. He is intimately involved in Genesis 1 and 2 in the creation of man and woman in a very intimate, earthy sort of way. You see the same thing happening with the healing of this particular man. Jesus uses spit. He probably spits on his hand and then uses his hand to touch the tongue of this man. He puts his fingers in his ears because God is not afraid to be hands-on in the creative and redeeming work that we, fallen humanity, need. So when Jesus touches this man in this kind of different sort of way, at least from our perspective, this is his way of acting as the Creator in the flesh to recreate this man who needs his work. And by the way, this use of saliva in healing is by no means limited to the Gospels. We have other examples in contemporary literature of the use of saliva in some sorts of healings. So it's strange to us, but this was by no means simply limited to the Gospels. And if you're interested, I'll put a slide up here. This is taken from Robert Gundry's Mark commentary, where he talks about the medicinal use of spittle, and there's a whole bunch of listings there of literature that you can check out on your own if you are interested. Now that he's done that, what's the response? What does Jesus say next, and what's the response of the crowd? Well, in verses 36 and 37, Jesus charged them to tell no one. Of course, he's doing this all the time with the Gospels. And every time that he does, it doesn't work because we have the description here of what happened after he told them, hey, don't tell anyone. The more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. In other words, he could not keep this quiet. Now, pay attention to this. They were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, that particular phrase of he has done all things well, compare that in Mark 7:37 with Genesis chapter 1, verse 31 in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation. So the Greek verb for done, he has done all things, is poieo. That's the same verb that is used in Genesis 1:31. God saw everything that he had poieoed, that he had made. The all things in Mark 7, he has done all things well, is panta, and then that is paralleled in Genesis 1:31. God saw all the things, or everything, ta panta, that he had made. And Mark 7:37, the people say he has done all things kalos. That's the adverb there for well. Now, the adjective form of that adverb is used in Genesis 1:31. Behold, it was very kalos. It was very good. So what's happening here? Well, the response of the people is basically their way of speaking the language of Genesis with regard to what Jesus has just done. This is one more example in this particular passage of how Jesus is effecting a new creation. We have it in this language of him groaning. So it's as it were, Jesus groans in this moment and then affects a new creation. His groaning is kind of an expression of the frustration of humanity being locked into this old and fallen world, and he follows that up by touching and speaking, and by touching and speaking, bringing about a new creation. And when the people see this, whether they fully realize what's going on or not, what their confession states is that the Creator has come in the flesh, and just like he made everything in the beginning and it was very good, so now Jesus, the Creator come in the flesh, who's healing his fallen creation, he has done very well. Everything that he does well because he comes to make good the bad creation. He comes to heal the wounded creation. He comes to give life where there is death, hearing where there is deafness, clarity where there is tongue-tiedness, healing where there is lameness. Jesus is healing all of creation. He doesn't come just to forgive our sins, but he also comes to give us life and salvation and resurrection and recreation. And all of this is embedded within this section of Mark chapter 7, where God comes in the flesh as the creator to confront a person who is trapped in the old, decrepit, fallen, groaning, hurting creation, and he touches him and he speaks his healing word, and as a result, this man is made well, and this man then becomes, as it were, a snapshot, a prophetic snapshot of our coming resurrection, where we too will be raised to newness of life with perfectly healed, resurrected bodies, and we will enjoy life in the new creation that Isaiah 35 depicted long before. So that is your reading the Gospels through Hebrew eyes for this week. I hope that now, when you read Mark 7:31 and following, you're going to see this as a picture of the regenesis work of the Messiah. Certainly he's acting out of compassion and love for one man, but his compassion and love for this one man is indicative of his compassion and love and recreative work for all humanity. It's good to be back. I was in Camp Arcadia last week, as perhaps you know from the previous video. I'm here now for a couple of weeks, and so I look forward to doing another video next week. Hope you're all doing well. God's grace and mercy be yours in abundance, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.